Hey, welcome back to the Health Bridge. Dr. Pedram Shojai here today with a neurologist who's got a great story and one that's really important for any of us who have kids. Dr. Frances Jensen, she is at the Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania. She is the chair of the neurology department, and she has a New York Times bestseller out that I don't need to read quite yet. I've already perused through. My kids aren't quite there, but it's called The Teenage Brain, and she's a single mother of two sons. And I love the subtitle of this book, A Neurologist's Survival Guide to Raising Adolescents and Young Adults. And this is a thing, right? This is a big stressor for most of us in our lives. And so let's jump in. Hey, welcome to the show, Doc.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, great. So what is it about teens that requires a survival guide? I mean, how do we get into this mess?
Well, the big news here is that probably in the last decade and a half, there's been a lot of new science, both coming from cellular, molecular, animal models, and also human studies because of advanced neuroimaging. They're really shedding light on how different the adolescent period is from childhood versus adults. I think it was thought probably literally up until 15 years ago that an adolescent was simply an adult with fewer miles on them, and that their brains were basically done, their bodies were done, so of course their brains would be done, right? Well, it turns out that's not true at all. There is a lot of really amazing science now to say that the brain, of course, which is our most complex organ in our body, takes, not surprisingly, the longest to develop and mature. So it is the last organ in the body to mature, takes until the mid to late 20s. There are some gender differences, with males being a couple of years behind females they catch up, but they're a little later to develop. And there's some very big differences, it turns out, in adolescence compared to childhood or adulthood. So I usually start by saying that there's sort of two important messages that we can develop in talking a little further. The one is that the brain is actually, there's strengths in adolescence that they'll never have again, but they're relative weaknesses because they haven't made it to an adult stage yet. So what are the strengths? The strengths are that the brain is very much more active in childhood and adolescence. Our brain cells, called neurons, connect to each other by something called synapses, little places, connection points, so that when you have a thought or when you're practicing a golf swing, as you practice and practice, these connection points get stronger. That capacity, first of all, adolescents and children have more synapses than adults do, so they have a competitive edge, and they can build them faster than we can. So their memory can actually be better and they can learn faster. We know this. In fact, children can learn 2 and 3 languages, flawlessly, whereas we really struggle as adults to get that. We get there, but it takes a lot longer. The machinery for this process is at higher levels in development, highest in childhood, coming down in adolescence to sort of boring old adults, when we get to adulthood. That's a strength, mostly. But the weakness that they have is that the brain, different brain areas are connected up to one another by pathways that have to be insulated, just like a rubber wire insulation to make the connection go faster. Our signals in our brain are truly electrical, and therefore they require the same kind of insulation as it would be for an electrical wire. We don't have rubber in our brains. We have something called myelin, a fatty substance. But that process, that wrapping of all of these pathways, we have miles of pathways in our brains going back and forth and down to our spinal cord. That pathway process of strengthening goes from the back all the way to the front in that order. So the last place to connect in your late 20s is your frontal lobe. And that's a process. It's the last place to fully connect. And the frontal lobe, and you'll smile when I say this, what are its functions? It's executive function, impulse control, judgment, empathy, reasoning. These are all things that, while an adolescent has their frontal lobe, it's not connected in a minute, like a super fast way. So for the on-the-spot, second by second access to that kind of reasoning and impulse control, they don't have. That's a relative weakness. So just in a nutshell, sometimes we say that the adolescent brain is like a Ferrari with weak brakes.
Okay, so this is revolutionary because the way we've been looking at this has all been, I don't know what's wrong with these kids, throw some Ritalin, throw some Adderall. They obviously, there's something broken. And so we're now saying physiologically the myelin isn't there yet. The pipes haven't been laid. They're simply still developing this executive function. And at that point, then what kind of strategies can we layer in to work with them and nuance kind of our understanding of the fact that they're not quite there yet?
Right. So first of all, I think that what seems to have been very appealing about this book that I wrote, which is all facts. So what I'm doing is translating facts from science into a way that, but keeping it valid, keeping it accurate, a way that people can kind of use that knowledge. And I always say knowledge is power, and this is knowledge you can use. So as a parent or counselor or teacher working with teenagers, I think it's really important to know about these basic strengths and weaknesses that they have, because first of all, it makes you more patient. You don't look at them and, if you really understand that it's biology playing itself out, that the fact that they're racing off to do something completely irrational, while it angers you, you can at least recognize that a piece of it is actually biology. One important thing that I think really frustrates people about the teenager is you perceive them as being very irrational and very headstrong with making very poor decisions often. And the other part is we get very irritated as adults and very frustrated by the influence of peers. The peer pressure effect and the extraordinary emotional outbursts that adolescents can have. And science can explain that too. It turns out, remember I said the brain connects from the back to the front? Well, your emotional areas are right about in here, in a place in the limbic system, which is sort of right behind, sort of inside where your ears are, in the middle of your brain. And so actually those areas, because they're behind the frontal lobe, connect up first. And they are pretty well connected for very on-the-spot access when you're in your mid-teens. So imagine this. You're dealing with a person that is under a huge amount of emotional pressure. Your limbic system, it's sexual desire, reward, novelty seeking, risk taking, all in there. And also being very much emotionally connected to wanting to be, liked. And so that's the peer pressure effect. All of that is very hooked up. Yet you don't have your frontal lobe saying, jumping off that cliff into the quarry, even though all my friends are doing it and it's going to make me the hero of the day, might not be a smart thing. You don't have that frontal lobe being able to say that to you. So I think for parents and teachers to understand that, it makes you step back and count to 10. And my whole big message to parents is don't alienate your kids. So you can turn, by knowing more about the science, you will make you a little bit less of an angry, frustrated human being so that you won't alienate, you won't shout at your children and create a rift, because actually they need you now as much as they needed you when they were a toddler. In fact, I say you have the frontal lobes as a parent, so you can give your kid a frontal lobe assist from time to time. And that means you can help them reason through things. You can help them with figuring out what homework to do every evening, because they don't have those organizational skills. Everybody's different. You'll have people that are very advanced who are in their teenage years, and then people who are in their 20s that are acting like 15-year-olds, because it's all relative. Everybody is going to mature, but everybody's slightly on their own little path and their own rate. So you can gauge with your child, you'll see the ability to make these decisions and use organization and rationality for decision making is something they will gradually get. Now, the important thing about your teenager, though, is that they're very, very, very good learners. They are learning machines, and that's because their synapses, as I told you, they have more of them, and they have more of the machinery to build them for a memory or for a skill set, which is how we, build our brains. So it's like nature versus nurture. That's the nurture part of it. The experience builds a better brain. So it turns out that they're in this window of a huge amount of opportunity here. It turns out you can marshal those forces to really work on your strengths and the things you're already good at, and then really try to correct your weaknesses. And it's kind of the last time in your life you can do that to the extent that you can as a teenager. In fact, recent data has shown that IQ can change in your teen years, which is, to me, astonishing. Because when I was being taught neurology and neuroscience, it was suggested that all is happening. It's an innate capacity. Whatever your IQ is kind of what you're stuck with. You can try to be an overachiever, but you've only got what you've got. Well, it turns out that's not true. And actually for schools, it's really important because it means that, at least in our country, we're very lucky because at the age of 14 or so, many countries will call you a scholar or not a scholar based on a standardized test. And off you go to vocational school or off you go to the university track. And when you think about what I've just told you, that's terribly sad because a lot of these people haven't even gotten there yet to even perform on the test. And they could change their IQ. A third of people's IQ goes up during their teen years, a third stays the same, and a third goes down. And so we want to understand what those things are you can do to make it go up and not go down.
Sure. And how much of that do we understand? I mean, is there...
We actually understand a fair amount. It turns out that environmental enrichment, just like it does in early life, you hear a lot about early childhood education and this whole thing of synaptic plasticity. This is a term, plasticity, that's used. Remember I said the synapses? So why we call it plasticity is that synapses can be molded to be bigger or smaller based on how much action is going through them on a regular basis. And that's learning. So with learning, since something's going through the same set of synapses, like a relay race from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, those connection points get stronger and stronger and stronger with use and bigger, like a muscle almost. And that's what we know now, the science of learning and memory. So teenagers, number one, I would caution any adult to ever try to compete with their teenager in a memory game because you will so lose. So they absolutely have a strength, but they can also use that capacity to build their synapses for their weaknesses as well. And it is known that environmental enrichment in reading, for instance, will increase your verbal IQ. Functional imaging studies can show beautiful maps of how brain areas are actually growing in response to this between the age of 13 and 20. It's continued brain growth, obviously. And then, unfortunately, we already know things that can make your brain shrink or not grow in the window and your IQ go down. One of those is our substance abuses, and one in particular where a lot has been written about now is cannabis. So daily cannabis use, chronic cannabis use, actually is one of those things that has been very well documented now in humans, not just animals, to drop your IQ if you chronic daily pot smoke through your teen years into early 20s. It will be a permanent decrease in your IQ, and it will not be reversible.
Wow. Yeah, that's big news because all over the country right now there's this obvious resurgence and legalization in all these different states, and it's kind of been a free for all. But as a parent, you have to be incredibly meticulous about what's happening with your kid, and so there's a direction you can take, and these teenage years are so fragile. So what else? I mean, we like whole body exercise, math, Sudoku. I mean, is it just challenging and stimulating brain cells for synaptic development and neuroplasticity? Are there certain things beyond that? Like for me, you put those teenagers in the temple, and everyone like kind of does their kung fu and works all the time and works on themselves. Now it's like you kind of feel like you've lost your kids, and they're out there, and society is going to have its way with them if you're not careful.
So yeah, I think you raise a really good point, and I think it's a discussion that nobody really knows how to address this properly. Clearly, we've never known as much about the teenage brain as we do now, and there's more to learn. It's like all of neuroscience, it's just exploding in terms of knowledge. So this is the first generation of which we've really known as much about their brains. And when I give talks to teenagers, and I do hope there are teenagers that actually have tuned into this program, because it's really good to have a user's manual of your brain. And we now know a lot more in this window and the capacity that they have. It's a time of extraordinary privilege where they can, they're myelinated enough. They've got enough of that myelin, that connection, that insulation to be very independent and very resourceful, but not quite got it all with the frontal lobe. But they have an incredible capacity to direct themselves to great learning experiences that will begin, this is like the last time you can really scaffold your brain. So one of the issues that I think is happening is that the teenage brain is naturally, because their reward systems are sort of on fire compared to ours as adults, they're out there novelty seeking. That's a natural tendency. That's what you want. You want to be built. Your nature made the teenage brain. And this is the case in every animal species also. There's a period like the teenage window where they've got a lot of capacity. Motor control is really good. They're now, almost adults. Their limbic system is making them want to novelty seek, because that's the point. They're trying to acquire experience. So the brain is trying to teach itself and map onto different environments that the body can put the brain into, right? So that's a good thing. But what I would say right now is I think that there has never been a generation of teenagers that has had this. It's unprecedented, the amount of stimulation that teenagers are getting. And that is probably through social networking and the ability to sort of connect and potential information overload. Mm-hmm. And we know that there are permanent effects of stress in adolescence that can bring on depression in adulthood. So it's also a window of vulnerability, just as much as they're very impressionable to good things, like I've just pointed out with pot, chronic pot smoking. They are very impressionable to bad things. A lot of the drugs work on synapses. They have more synapses. So they're going to have more stronger and longer lasting effects of drugs. And also drugs will affect you, long term. They're going to affect the way your brain develops, right? So I think that we, have to think about this as a community around teenagers. How do we manage the stressors of like watching an ISIS video or, getting cyberbullied? Schoolyard pranks. All teenagers have done stupid things, and it might have involved taking a picture with a Polaroid camera and putting it up on a bulletin board. And it's a nasty thing to do, impulsive, silly thing that teenagers do to each other. But now they're posting those pictures on the internet or live streaming, like with Tyler Clementi, a kid, back in New York about 3 years ago, who was his college roommate. These were college freshmen, because, by the way, your brain is not done when you start college, and it is not done when you finish college. So what this kid did was he placed the laptop facing the bed of this roommate. The roommate came back and actually hadn't told anybody that he was gay, and actually was there with a same-sex partner, and the whole thing video streamed on air.
Oh, God.
Everywhere. And the kid got so stressed out, Tyler, the boy, who was an incredible violinist, a really gifted child, 18 years old or so. And 2 days later, he jumped off the George Washington Bridge and killed himself. Oh, yeah. And if that had been a schoolyard prank, that Polaroid picture would have just been taken down. 10 people have known about it, and it would have been a really horrible week. But he wouldn't have had such a profound response, right?
Right. Now the entire world, as we know it, knows, because nothing is a secret. Yeah, and so this era that we're growing up in now with these kids is absolutely fundamentally different than anything we've ever known, right? Social media has created this really interesting world. It's Wild Wild West, and the stressors with that are new. Right. So how much of this time on Facebook, I know we had a guest a while back who had done some research and said that social media time actually in adults was decreasing cortisol levels because it was considered downtime. And so, net, it was a positive thing. And I thought that was kind of a head scratcher for me. For kids, are we noticing anything different neurologically with, like, say, social media time versus, reading and actual, kind of?
Well, it concerns me. It concerns me because I think they are having, there's an element of social isolation that goes along with all this social media. The fact that, many kids will come home, race through the front door, run to the refrigerator, grab something, go up to their room, slam the door behind them, and get back online. And where's the family connection? Where's the, like, how are you doing? Where's the ability of a parent or a sibling to say, that he's looking a little disheveled, got dark rings under his eyes, maybe he's not well. We are potentially missing opportunities to detect subtle changes in our kids because of the fact that everybody's just like isolated. Of course, mental illness, another point to make, and I make this in the book, an important one to bring up here, is that the brain, the time when most people acquire for the first time their first bout of a mental illness like depression or schizophrenia or bipolar is coincidentally, and it's not coincidentally, in the teen years or early adulthood. That is the time when mental illness comes on. And actually, important neuro fact to know about this is that you need much of your frontal lobe to be connected in order to kind of do schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disease. You can't do it on a child brain structure. It has to have more of a mature brain structure in order to be that disease. And many mental illnesses, including anxiety, tend to come up in that teenage window and in early adulthood. So again, this is a time when we should be screening people, like we screen 50-year-olds for colonoscopy, for colon cancer. We should be, screening people because it's so frequent. 1 in 4 people have mental illness of some kind. And yet this is a window where they're isolating themselves, and we don't know what kind of stressors, because the environment can cause you to be stressed, that's happening online. It's an important conversation to have. I think that it's not going away. You can't tell them to not be online. This is a skill set they're going to need to survive as they move into their adult lives. Clearly they're incredible multitaskers and can adeptly use the internet. But I think we have to begin to think about, how do you gate yourself? How do you, without a frontal lobe fully functioning, how do you say to yourself, I'm not going to press that button and look at that ISIS video. I'm not going to do this. So they are good learners. And I said this earlier. So you can begin to sort of teach them. And that's where the adult needs to give them a frontal lobe assist. And we need to actually help them think through this. And what do they need? How do they need to protect themselves?
You're the mother of 2 teenage sons. And so you've got, this very close to home, and now they're young adults. What drove you to write this book? And then I'd love to hear a couple examples of frontal lobe assists that one can use in some of this decision making. I mean, obviously when we're with them, we could do it. So, I'd love to see how we can kind of keep our voice in their heads when we're not with them.
Okay, so again, my book, I try very hard to not make it like a self-help book. This book is actually a book where I'm a credible source. I'm in the field myself. I do research on brain development, and I wanted to bring this science to everybody, because usually there's like a decade between when science is done and when the public kind of hears about it or is using it, right? In this case, there's so much coming out that has so much practical application. It's amazing. So why did I write this book? I wrote this book because I myself, as a scientist, was a neuroscientist working on brain development and looking actually at epilepsy is something I study, which can come on at different stages in development. And it matters what stage of development you're in, whether you're a child, infant, adult, or elderly, what kind of medicine or what the process is. How would you treat the patient? So I've been working in this area anyway. And then I realized that I had an experiment going on in my own home, which were my 2 sons. And they were changing dramatically as they hit adolescence. And I was a single parent, and I'm like, I'm not going to get this, I'm not going to mess this up. And I know that there's biology behind this. And I turned what could have been frustration and anger into curiosity and hit my own laboratory as well as the literature and started to decipher all of the stuff that has just been coming out. And I find myself on sidelines with parents, at a football game saying, hey, so that's why, this happens. And they're like, so that's why they do it. Oh, now I know. It's not just me being a terrible parent. I'm like, no, and it's not them being a terrible teenager either. It's biology. So I would give these talks. I started to give talks called Teen Brain 101 talks to high schools. And one thing led to another. Then we were on NPR. And then I got a publisher saying you should write this book up. And I'm like, no, I don't need to write a book. And they're like, you could. And I did. So, and I'm glad I did, because I took a lot of the elements that I would naturally just say in a talk, or, when I'm counseling people, I put it into the book. It's facts that you can use, and hopefully you'll use them in the right way. It's pretty obvious what the right way to use them is. But it's not, I'm a credible scientist. So everything I wrote in that book is accurate. It is not massaged or made into exaggerated in any way. There's nothing that I wrote in the book, and the book has been out for a year and a half, that has had to be retracted. It's scientifically 100% valid and accurate, and it's put in the context of news stories, of personal experiences. So for me, I made what I tried to do is tell my kids sometimes when I could see something that happened to them, unfortunately, like any parent that's listening to this now, or any teenager that might be listening to this, the average person, sadly, when they're going through high school, will probably have 1 to 2 people commit suicide, somebody at least 1 or 2 people have a DUI, or some other accident that involves substance abuse, and someone else who will have like a psychotic break. I mean, these are big events, and they're going to happen in everybody's environment. So the point is, how do you take those stories for your teenager when one of those things happens and say, there's a reason why this happened? For instance, I pointed out when I put a couple of these examples in the book, but I think it's important to when you tell your child something, they are so not going to listen to you if they think you're boring. So first of all, you can't say it with anger. And the second is, you have to make it catch their attention. And I've been recently, when I've been giving public talks on this, I'm saying that if you want to get something across to your teenager, because they're so information savvy and they're data miners, you need to make it like a TED Talk. You have to actually elicit enough interest from them and make it a TED Talk if you want them to learn something. You have to capture their attention. So, for instance, if there's a friend of a friend of a friend in the same community had, these were teenagers, they were out late at night going swimming, they'd all drunk too much, they went swimming, they climbed over a fence into a community pool, they all swam, and then they, stagger back home very drunk, and they look around the room and go, where's Dan? And they're like, whoa, where is he? And they go back to the pool, there he is, dead under the water, having been swimming drunk, which if you lose your oxygen when you're drunk, your body doesn't say, wake up, get me up to the top of the pool. You just fall asleep under the pool and you're dead. And I would say, I said that same thing to my kids. I think I got through to them. You need to remind them that they're gonna do really risky things, and that they should really think twice. So giving them a lot of examples, graphic examples of things that didn't go right and did go right. So, there's also the flip side, very positive things you can tell them about a kid that practiced something and went from a C student to an A student. There's a lot of things like that, but you have to make it a little bit concrete for them as you're giving them examples. It's very important. So I would use these unfortunately frequent things in your environment or on the news that come up all the time as teaching points for your kid. Addiction, of course, substance abuse is huge in this window. It's very easy for them to access drugs because of social media. And guess what? Addiction, they learn faster, their synapses grow faster. Well, addiction is a form of synaptic plasticity and learning, unfortunately, in your addiction circuits. So a teenage brain uses every brain uses the same molecular processes to become addicted as it does to learn a vocabulary or a times table, except it's just in a different part of your brain. So it's repeated exposure, not to a fact, but to a drug. And you can build an addiction circuit. Addiction is a disease. It can happen to every one of us. And just like teenagers are better learners, they're unfortunately better addictors. They can get addicted harder, longer, stronger, faster, just like they can learn harder, longer, stronger, faster. So I would tell them that. And we talk about like people that started to smoke when they were teenagers, for instance, got addicted to nicotine, have a really hard time backing off, as adults. Whereas if you acquire an addiction in adulthood, it's easier to undo it. So there's a lot of things like that to tell them. They want knowledge. They love novelty. They're trying to figure out who they are. They're at a painful point in their lives where they They want to know why they did that stupid thing the night before and not own it. And what a relief to them to know that that dumb thing they did at that party last Saturday night doesn't need to define them. It was simply their frontal lobe not on.
Yeah, no, it's very empowering because, it's easy for us to criminalize them. It's easy for us to infantilize their behavior, and so they're just still growing. They're still our babies. So no, this is great. I think that any parent listening to this who has a teenager needs to read the book and just kind of get into understanding the science behind this, because we need to have a fighting chance. And there's so many things working against us in our community that, the more we know, the better off we are, and the more we know how to help our kids. Well, obviously it's, this is a very important time. So again, give us the name of the book and where people can find it.
It's The Teenage Brain, a neuroscientist's guide to raising adolescents and young adults. And it's HarperCollins, and you can get it on Amazon or any bookstore. It's in hardcover and in paperback recently, and it was a New York Times bestseller.
Great. Well, thanks for doing the work that you do. I think that this is really important stuff, and that, we're all trying to figure this out. And I'm glad you, I don't want to say broke ranks, but just kind of jumped out ahead and shared some of this data sooner, because it does take a long time for some of this information to come down from the ivory towers, and people are suffering every day. I mean, listen, if you have a teenager right now, by the time this stuff would come out, they're already, outside of that strike zone, right? And so we won't have the opportunity. Yeah.
Right. So here's a copy of the book. That's what it looks like for those of you that are interested.
Great. Excellent. Dr. Frances Jensen, thank you so much for your time. Good luck with everything. Good luck with those kids, and keep up the good work.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.